to the second in our series of what we called initially the Climate Reality series. It came out of a bottle of red wine sometime back when Andrew King and I and Lara and a few others from SENG were sitting down saying, we've now got these two policies that have gone through Congress and been approved by the EA Council, as it was then, board now. One on sustainability and what engineers need to do for sustainability and ecosystem service protection and so on. And the other one on climate change, which is a bit of a breakthrough as far as I'm concerned, because it says in its very first paragraph, Engineers Australia and its members accept the comprehensive science around climate change and the contribution of anthropogenic global warming, and that this will have serious consequences for society. Now that was a real landmark, getting Congress to agree to that. Those two policies were approved by, as I said, the board in November 2014. And our concern was that nothing much has happened in Engineers Australia since they were approved. There was, I suspect, a bit of a feeling that we've approved those policies, that's it. Engineers Australia now doesn't need to do any more because we've just approved the policies. That's all you do, isn't it? So a few of us have been a little bit upset that not much has happened. So Andrew and Lara and others in SENG decided we needed to develop some programs that would give some impetus to those policies and put some credibility and some action around them. So we thought, first off, we'd have Ian Dunlop talk as an eminent speaker and go around Australia. That didn't quite come together, but we did get Ian in Sydney on the 2nd of August at what we called the Big Conversation, and we held it at UTS in their great hall. It was totally filmed, and it's now been seen, the video's now been seen on YouTube by over 500 people, as well as the 200 odd that we got in the room on a very rainy night in Sydney. So that was terrific. It mismatched slightly because Ian was talking in Melbourne about a month or 6 weeks before that in the first of the Climate Reality series. And I'm sticking with that title, Climate Reality, because it really is about the climate reality, as I hope you'll realise after you hear Ian and Neil talk tonight. Before we get into it, may I recognise the Indigenous owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, on your behalf as well as mine. The order of events is I'm going to ask our Queensland President, Peter Ho, to come up and give a little bit of welcome on behalf of Engineers Australia. Then we'll move straight into Ian Dunlop's presentation. I'll introduce Ian. We'll have a few questions after Ian's thing, and we're going live out through Australia. I think we have 60 people registered on the webinar and in Engineers Australia offices around Australia, which is fantastic. And welcome those that are on the webinar to tonight's presentations. We'll have a few questions, and I'll limit it to, say, 3 questions for Ian. Then I'll introduce Neil. He'll give his presentations, and we'll do the same, just specific questions for Neil. Then we'll open it up to a panel discussion, and I'll invite at the end Dr. Andrew King, the famous author of the Engie Bear series, which I hope you've all seen. And he'll do a wrap-up and thank you, and then we'll all move outside for networking and some drinks. So, Peter, would you please come up and welcome us to Engineers Australia?
2012, isn't it? 2012.
Yeah.
Thank you. The 2012 National President, Professor David Hood. I'm going to make sure this is in the right year. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land that we're in here today, and recognize their continuing link with the air, with the water, with the environment, with the community, which they have continuing doing that, and pay respect to them, to the culture, to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Being the local president of Queensland Division, I love to welcome every one of you. Those sitting in here, those in somewhere in other part of the state, those sitting in your room, looking through your screen on your computer, that linking up to this particular session, I congratulate the SENG, of course, the Sustainable Engineering Society, of hosting such a very important event, of which we all know we're only living in, there's only one world. One world we live together. Until a day we find another planet somewhere in the space, we're able to live in there, but for the moment it's only one. So how do we actually make sure in the future that our kids, our grandkids, our great-great-grandkids, able to really enjoy what we're doing, what we're enjoying today. That is sustainability. That's a whole very important topic. We, as an engineer, that being now in the engineering Australia, we want to being the voice of the profession, we want to speak up. We want to get the community to understand that we engineer what we do at the same time in this particular topic. Let's put the technical on the table. Let's look at the technical issue. What can we, as an engineer, get everybody understand this important topic that affect not us, the future generation. And it's today, let's bring the two experts, come together. Let's have a live discussion at the end. I even love a bit later. Let's have a bit of drink out there, and we have a bit of not fight, rather conversation on the same topic. Thanks very much. Continue.
Thank you, Peter. And yes, leadership is the issue that I've been very strong about. Engineers need to take that leadership role and actually make sure the community can see that engineers understand, know the science, make people aware of the science, but then, importantly, work for the solutions and promote the solutions that engineers are going to have to find to this crisis that's coming. Leading right in, it's my great pleasure to welcome Ian Dunlop and ask him to give a talk. Ian is an oil, gas and coal executive in the past. He was the Australasian Chief Executive of Shell. And then he did some fantastic work around scenario planning for the company in terms of the future of the fossil fuel industry. Ian was frightened with what he saw out of that work. He then put it to the board, and Ian moved on. He worked with the Australian Greenhouse Office Experts Group in developing Australia's first carbon trading scheme. He also worked in the Coal Industry Association, thinking he could do similar work on scenario planning about the future of the coal industry. Not sure how long you lasted there, Ian, but he then moved to AICD, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, as the CEO, and tried again to influence business in Australia in terms of the risk of climate. He's now doing great work for a number of organisations, Australia 21, a bit of a think tank around the sort of identity of Australia. He is also still active in AICD in trying to sort of convince directors and so on about their responsibility around the great risks that are posed. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Ian to talk to you tonight.
So I think we just moved the slides through here. Whoops. There we go. Good. Well, Peter, David, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to the Queensland Society this evening. This is probably the biggest issue, I think, that the world, the country, engineers and everybody else is going to have to face in the coming decades. And it's one that our conversation, quite frankly, at the moment, is way off the mark. We're just not seriously talking about the types of changes that we are going to have to confront over the next few years. So what I'd like to do this evening is really cover the emergency action part of what I call the climate and energy dilemma. Because you hear a lot of talk about climate change, but you cannot separate the climate and energy solutions. You really have to look at this as an integrated problem. And there are a lot more things beside just climate and energy. I mean, this encompasses really everything we do. The entire economic system, the social system, is going to go through really quite radical change over a very short period of time, most likely, in my view. That's not the official view, but we'll come to the reasons basically for that. So what I'd like to do very quickly this evening is talk about, firstly, what is the problem globally, the global problematic. Second, climate, energy, the dilemma of the two, the risk and uncertainty implications of the dilemma, and then the solutions and opportunities. I'll go through the beginning of this fairly quickly, and we can sort of talk about any key points in the question time, or if you have anything that really is concerned, just shout out as we go along. Well, firstly, the problem we really have, and that is that exponential growth in both population and consumption within a finite system. Now, I think it's pretty clear that our civilization, the way we set it up, only really works if it's growing. But the problem is that that growth is now destroying the entire basis on which the civilization was created. So unless we really start to think hard about that dilemma, the system as we know it will probably reach the point of collapse. And I don't say that lightly, because I think that is the way that a number of groups around the world thinking about this, seeing the conclusions they've reached. And you can see the beginnings of this now in what is occurring with the impact of humanity on the biophysical system around the world. The big issue, of course, is population growth. And if you look at the way population has changed in recent time, we are at an absolutely unique point. I mean, if you look at the beginning just after World War II, we had virtually an empty world. It was about, 2 billion people or slightly less. Today, we've got about 7 billion, a bit more, and you'd have to regard that as being essentially a full world. So the question is, where are we going to? Now, if you listen to the UN, we're going to end up not with 7, but probably 9.5, 10, 11, depending on the scenario you adopt in terms of population growth. But I think there's a real question as well whether we're going to get anywhere near that because of constraints we're now putting on the biophysical system. Now, that population growth has really occurred basically since World War II. Before that, we were sort of, gradually increasing, but it's taken off exponentially since World War II. And the only reason for that has been fossil fuels. I mean, the fact is that if we hadn't had fossil fuels, and you can see the growth here in terms of the components, this is actually emissions on the on the vertical axis, but it gives you the proportioning roughly. We would never have seen the population growth we have. So humanity has learned to use those fossil fuels to our benefit. I'm not here to knock fossil fuels as such, because it's obviously created enormous wealth. It's got a lot of people out of poverty, and it's still doing that. But the problem is you can have too much of a good thing. And if you get to the point where the use of those fossil fuels are now destroying the entire basis for civilization, which indeed is what's happening, then you have to start rethinking the system. Now, the result of all of that is that humanity's become the dominant force essentially around the world. Basically, we are now, of all of the species, dictating what is happening globally. And if you look at the latest assessment, we need about 1.6 planets to live on in total of biophysical capacity. But if you took the entire world population of 7 billion and we all lived at Australian levels, we'd actually need about 5.4 planets. If you look at US levels, it would be less, about 4.8, and so on down. You can see the list on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side here. China's about 2 planets, India's below 1, about 0.7. I mean, clearly this is a totally unsustainable picture globally at 1.6 planets. But it really means that Australia basically is one of the most selfish and unsustainable societies on Earth. And it's largely because of the dominance of fossil fuels in our energy mix. Now, we don't like to think of that. We tend to think, this is a great country, it's highly sustainable, we have all this open space and we're very good at using our resources. But that is now the implication of what Australian society means in a global context, which clearly, we cannot sustain that sort of system to any sensible degree. And in a global sense, it means that the spotlight is going to be more and more on the way that Australia is actually operating. Now, a lot of people say, yes, but that's not such a problem because we're such a small country, and in comparison with the Chinas and the Indias of this world, it really doesn't matter. But the fact is that everybody is going to be under pressure to live far more sustainably, and we're not going to be able to escape that pressure. Now, we have a lot of talk politically about the need to reboot economic growth, which has stalled basically since the global financial crisis in 2008. We're all attempting to do that globally. We're trying to reboot the economy with so-called quantitative easing, which is very cheap money being put into the system. And it's basically not working. And the problem is that that growth is now being constrained by a number of key biophysical limits. And the first one of those is the declining availability of cheap oil, the so-called energy return on investment concept that I'll come back to. The second is climate change, namely that you keep putting carbon emissions into the atmosphere. We are getting to a point where the entire global system is going to grind to a halt for reasons I'll come to. Linked to that is increasing shortage of water around the world and increasing scarcity of food or increasing prices of food. Those are all biophysical. If you look then at the financial and social worlds, we're seeing increasing instability in financial circles and indeed in social conflict. For example, the conflicts in the Middle East, in Syria, in North Africa, the migration crisis into Europe. All of those things are talked about in terms of either military or social conflict, religious conflict. But behind virtually all of them is the problem of climate change. The fact that resources are getting scarce, prices are going up, water availability is dropping, land is being constrained as populations increased, and the pressure then comes on basically to see massive movements of people moving, trying to find a better life in different parts of the world. So we're now getting to the point where you cannot reboot the 20th century system in the way that we've been able to do historically. I mean, previously we've had problems, but we've managed to find a way around it, either technically or because we had, more space or whatever. With the population today and the biophysical limits that we're now seeing, you can't do that any longer. So something has to give. So let me talk about, firstly, climate change, which is happening faster, much more extensively, I think, than we anticipated and is acknowledged officially. It's primarily driven by human carbon emissions from fossil fuel combustion, from agricultural activities and land clearing. So let's just look at what the current policy-making paradigm is really saying. It says, look, climate change, this is the official world view, if you like, and particularly from a corporate point of view and most political groups. Climate change is not yet dangerous, and taking temperature increase up to 2 degrees C higher than pre-industrial levels is manageable, because the big tipping points, those are the points at which you get massive changes in the climate system, where you move from one relatively stable system to another which is far less stable and far less conducive to human development. Those tipping points, which I'll come back to in a minute, are unlikely to occur before we hit 2 degrees C temperature increase. We have a substantial amount of carbon, therefore we can still burn before we hit the 2 degrees C limit. So in other words, we can keep on using our current industrial system for a bit longer. That's called the carbon budget, you may hear of. So that means there's time for an orderly, non-disruptive reduction in emissions within the current economic and political paradigm. It means that therefore we can mitigate trying to stay below 2 degrees C, but 2 degrees C, well, it's not perhaps really so critical, and if we fail to stay below it, then we can adapt to 4 degrees C. And despite the recent Paris meeting, which is basically saying 2 degrees C has to be the limit, but we ought to be aiming for less than that, for reasons I'll come to. What in effect we're doing in terms of the way the world is currently working is not really doing that at all. We're heading towards 3 degrees C and really giving up on the 2 degrees C limit. That's actually what the practical implications of our current activity mean. Now, the mindset of the, if you like, political and corporate incumbency says, look, Population is going to go up from 7 billion to around 9 billion by 2050, maybe more, depending on the scenario you believe. To alleviate poverty with those increased numbers, we have to grow economically. That means essentially that growth requires energy. We really have to expand fossil fuels in a major way, as other sources really can't meet this demand, the renewables and so on that are coming on. So global warming is important, but really it's relatively secondary to the growth imperative. Unless we get growth right, then of course we'll have greater poverty and what have you. So governments are unlikely to act to address climate change quickly, and companies and investors are therefore justified in continuing with business as usual until they're told otherwise. That's the story I think you hear coming through. And then if we do have a problem with climate change, then you've got solutions like carbon capture and storage, which will handle any warming impact, and that's likely to be relatively minor. So therefore, you know, we can continue with the current paradigm without getting too concerned about instant change. Now, I'd like to suggest to you that that's fundamentally flawed. That entire position you cannot sustain in the light of the facts and the evidence that are occurring around the world at the moment. Just look at a bit of paleoclimate history here. This is the picture of temperature going back 65 million years or so. And if you go back on the left-hand side here, you can see this red peak, which is a thing called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which is a major extinction event, actually. I won't go into the reasons for it. After that peak in temperature, then temperature declined, and you can see the squiggly line, and it went continued to decline. Now, about 37 million years ago, you started to see the southern and polar regions ice over. Antarctica started to ice over, so the Antarctic glaciation began and then continued as temperature continued to drop, moving to the right. About 4.7 million years ago, the northern hemisphere glaciation began, and that then continued. And if you follow the graph right through for the last 500,000 years on the right-hand side, you then have this sort of cyclic sort of ice age and warming cycle through various geological eras. Then right at the far right-hand side, you have the last 10 or 12,000 years, which is the geological Holocene period, which is the period in which humanity as we currently know it has really evolved. We were here, you know, a long time before that, but not in our current form. And the only reason we moved into, say, agriculture in the way we now have it is because through that 10, 12,000 years, we had a relatively stable climate, which was about 15 degrees C plus or minus half a degree C. You had fluctuations in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, but basically it was an incredibly stable period in which humanity then really got established, agriculture developed and what have you. Now the problem we've now got, I'm sorry the graph is perhaps a little bit off on the edge, but the peak Holocene is that little green arrow you can see on the far right-hand corner. And the point we're now at is the orange arrow, which is somewhat above that. We're now above the peak Holocene. The target that we're talking about to keep temperature below 2 degrees C is the red line. And if you follow that red line back in history, you'll see you intersect out here at a point which is, in fact, before the northern hemisphere started icing over. So the implication of that basically is that if you stabilize climate at a 2 degrees C temperature increase, in time, it won't happen straight away, but in time you're going to come back to the point where there will be no ice in Greenland and possibly the West Antarctic actually, and you'd end up with a 6 or 7 metre sea level increase. Now that's what the implications of 2 degrees C really mean in terms of geological history. But we're currently headed for a temperature increase of around 4 degrees C above pre-industrial, which is the actual purple line there. And if you take that back, you come to the point before the Antarctic glaciation. That's what we're currently doing. And that would mean a sea level increase of probably 70 metres. Now, even the 6 or 7 metres is going to fundamentally alter the way the world works, given the number of people living close to coastlines and what have you, and the industrial economic activity that goes on in those areas. So even a 2 degrees C temperature increase is basically telling us that we're looking at a fundamentally changed world, not straight away, but in due course that's what you're locking in. Now that doesn't get talked about a little bit, but that's the implication of current negotiations. There's been a lot of debate about, well, you know, is the Earth really warming? Maybe it's not, maybe it's all a hoax. These are pictures from NASA through the last 6 decades, and as you see, the darker areas are increased warming. It's crystal clear that we're now seeing major warming going on all around the world, but the particular point is that the Arctic polar region is warming far faster than anywhere else. And that's where we're now seeing the major changes taking place in the melting of the permafrost, the melting of the sea ice, the beginnings of the melt of the Greenland ice sheet. The global surface temperature change since the 1880s, you can see it's summarized in these pictures, again from NASA. The one on the right, the left is the annual mean, or a 5-year running mean. The one on the right is taking a longer averaging to sort of get rid of shorter term fluctuations. And you can see the real peaking occurring just in the last few years. That started with the El Nino that we've had. It's now jumped way up. And what we were expecting is the temperature would start to come down on a global average, but it hasn't done that. And that's a real cause for concern. So the temperature's going up faster than we think. We talk about a 2 degrees C temperature increase, but if you look at the real changes that are going on, there are 2 baselines people use. One is 1880 to 1909 roughly, and the other is the genuine 1750 pre-industrial temperatures, and there's about a 0.2 degrees C difference between the two. Now, if you take the last 30 years, we've seen an average from the mid-17th century pre-industrial of about 0.85 degrees C. If you take just the last 10 years, the difference is 1.13 degrees C. If you look at what happened in 2015 to the end of 2015, we've already seen 1.43. And February of this year was actually 1.8 degrees C above genuine pre-industrial. Now that's 1 month. The warming through 2016 thus far is about 1.57. Now, the target of negotiations is to hold temperature increase to less than 2 and ideally towards 1.5. Now that was supposed to happen by 2100. But what we're seeing is these are the temperatures that are occurring today. So hence the reason for concern that we've got it wrong in terms of underestimating the speed of what's actually happening. Now I mentioned tipping points, and all around the world there are areas where you're starting to see big changes occurring very quickly and moving from one stable position to another one. It's things like the Arctic sea ice, where the sea ice cap has basically reflected solar radiation as it comes in from space back out again. And the result of that is that the ocean temperature doesn't get as warm because a fair bit of solar radiation goes back into the atmosphere. As that ice melts, the grey-green sea absorbs more solar radiation, which means you get a kick up in warming, which means you lose more sea ice, which means you get a positive feedback loop in engineering terms that accelerates the process exponentially. You then get other things kicking in, like the warming of the waters in the Arctic then starts to melt the permafrost, which is a major sink of carbon, which once it warms up starts emitting that carbon back to atmosphere. And we're starting to see that happen with methane emissions in the Arctic seas, and some strange things happening in Siberia, for example. We're getting outbursts where gas is coming up through the permafrost. There are a number of other points. Basically, the jet stream around the northern hemisphere is has been something that has had a slight sinusoidal shape and goes around and controls the northern hemisphere temperature. Because of these changes in the Arctic, that amplitude is now becoming much more pronounced. And it's leading to a lot of the extreme temperatures you're seeing, for example, in Europe and North America over the last few years, which in turn locks in major heat waves or major rainfall, precipitation events. And there are a number of others in the Antarctic, in the Amazon rainforest, the El Nino that we experience. I won't go through all of them. But the point is, these things suddenly change the framework of the climate around the world in a way that can become potentially extremely dangerous for human development. And the evidence suggests that these are starting to trigger. Now, these are the things the scientists have been very concerned we didn't trigger, but it is now starting to happen. People then say, yeah, okay, well, if we don't hit 2 degrees C, we can adapt to 4 degrees C. But that is not what the experts believe. These are a few quotes, which I won't go through all of them, basically saying, look, 4 degrees C, in the words of John Schellenhuber, as the director of the Potsdam Institute in Germany on climate impact research, probably one of the world's top climate scientists. What's the difference between 2 and 4 degrees C? It's basically human civilization, because we would end up with a major reduction in population if we got to 4 degrees C, because large parts of the world would become uninhabitable, either from heat stress or lack of water, desertification, and so on. And a number of other experts, including the World Bank, Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, make similar comments. Now, these are not sort of green activist groups. I mean, these are hard-nosed economic rationalists who have these concerns. So, this concern is growing globally. It's not really registered in this country yet, but the rest of the world is frankly moving on, and we're not. So what have we done in the last 30 years? Well, basically very little. I mean, this is a picture of historical emissions on the left, and then the scenarios of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as to where we may get to, depending on what action we take. The business as usual is the red line going up to the top, and this is emissions from fossil fuels on the vertical axis. And the blue line is what we have to do if we actually want to stay below 2 degrees C. Now, the black is where we're currently headed, which, as you can see, is almost straight on the red line. So we haven't really achieved very much at all, despite all the negotiations over 30 years and the agreements and what have you. The impact has been minimal. The other big issue on climate change is the fact that the system has built in a lag. So whatever we do today in terms of investment decisions, you don't see the full effect for decades to come. So if we keep on building fossil fuel facilities, whether it be power stations, coal mines, oil and gas operations and so on, we are locking in a system where the temperature will keep on rising, the sea level will keep on rising, even if we pull the emissions down very quickly. So we should be moving very fast to essentially change that. It's a bit like this frog in boiling water argument. I mean, as you slowly heat up the water in a pan, I mean, you have this argument about, well, we're being slowly cooked, we're being slowly boiled, nobody can agree at what point you really jump out of the pot, right? And whether we're going to be leaders in doing this or lemmings. So far, we've certainly been lemmings. So then let's look at energy. The conventional view of world energy demand is, and this is a picture from Shell, but it comes from the other fossil fuel companies and the International Energy Agency, that we'll continue to see the domination of fossil fuels through to 2030. That means that if we follow that path in the next 25 years, we're going to consume all of the fossil fuels the world has ever consumed since the just the beginning of the century, roughly. That doesn't seem terribly sensible. The other problem we have, though, is that the cheap, low-hanging fruit of fossil fuel we're now using up. This is a picture of the energy return on energy investment. If you go out exploring for energy, you have to spend a certain amount to get the energy out. In other words, you've got to build your drilling rigs, your pipelines, your tankers to actually extract the oil and get it to the market. If you go back in time to the heyday of the world oil industry in the Middle East, the ratio is about 100 to 1. You had to put 1 barrel of oil in, you got 100 out, so it was a great deal financially, and you kept on doing it. Now, as time's gone by, that ratio has dropped as we've used up the cheaper sources, and it's now down in the 20s, 20 to 1. The red section on this graph is basically the energy you have to invest to extract energy, and the green is the energy available for use in society in a wider sense, to run the cities, to run the trains, the buses, the aeroplanes, and so on. Now, the newer technologies coming through have all got relatively low energy return on energy investment, which is a problem because, fossil fuel has been a highly concentrated source, and that's been very useful. The problem we've got is that to run an industrial society, you probably need a ratio of around 10 to 1, which is the vertical line there. A lot of what we've got is below that level, although as you get efficiency improvements coming in and things like renewables, then of course the return comes up a bit. But what it means is that if we fall below that level, you can't actually maintain economic growth in the way we've known it. Now, we're already actually seeing that because one of the reasons, the main reasons that the economic systems around the world are not getting rebooted into higher growth rates is because the cost of energy is now becoming relatively high compared with what it was historically. Nobody talks about that. It's all talked about in economic terms and innovation and jobs and growth in a conventional sense. But underneath it all is the lack of sustainable, cheap energy in the way that we've had it way back since World War II. Now, the alternatives are making great strides. We're seeing renewables coming in very quickly and with costs coming down and efficiencies improving, which is great. But the trouble is they're coming off a very low base. And today they still are only about 15% overall of the energy mix, and that's including traditional biomass and so on. So the challenge we've got is scaling it all up to the point where it can take over from the role of fossil fuels, which is still, in the 80% of total world consumption. And we've got to do that very quickly because of the need to actually stop carbon emissions. So the dilemma we actually have is that if you look at the total picture of fossil fuels, if you take the proven reserves around the world and you were to burn them, then the emissions you would get are shown in this graph. So gas is green, oil is orange, coal, and then the total. That would be the total emissions of burning the entire proven reserves. What the scientists are telling us is that we can only burn less than 30% of those fossil fuels to have a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees C. Now, what we know now is that 2 degrees C is too high, and 50% is actually not a terribly good chance of preserving human civilization. You're engineers, you think in risk terms. You don't go out and build a bridge with a 50-50 chance of it collapsing, or get on a plane to go to Sydney with a 50% chance of getting there. You wouldn't accept it. But in these terms, we are saying that is what we're implicitly accepting in doing this. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong in the way the world is looking at this problem when you confront the facts of that sort of assessment. So then you have to say, well, why are we continuing to spend shareholders' money looking for more fossil fuels, for example, in the Great Australian Bight, in deep waters in the Arctic, in the Gulf of Mexico, all around the world? And you're starting to see, in fact, oil companies now returning money to the shareholders because they are recognising they cannot actually do this anymore. So you have a different value being placed on fossil fuel companies in the stock market, and you've seen the price of coal companies, for example, collapse dramatically over the last few years as these sorts of issues start to bite in the marketplace. So coming back to that 50-50 thing, you say, well, okay, if 50-50 is no good, well, what sort of risk are you prepared to accept? Well, this is a graph of probability of success of staying below 2 degrees C versus the emissions you can afford to burn. And the blue line is the probability function. Now, the emissions so far are this grey bar that sits in the industrial revolution, about 600 gigatons or thereabout. If you say, well, I want a 33% chance of staying below 2 degrees C, then that's your total budget with the green line, 1,200 or so. Take off the emissions so far, so you've got a budget still remaining, the carbon budget, of around sort of 600 gigatons. If you say, well, we don't accept that, that's not good enough odds, then that's the effect of 50-50. You can do the same for 2/3 chance. But if you say, look, I'm not prepared to accept that, we need, say, a realistic chance of success, say 90%, which is still not actually very good odds. You wouldn't get on a plane on that basis to travel very far. If you take it to 90% chance, then you actually have no carbon budget left today. So that means we should no longer be emitting a ton of carbon from today on. Or if we do, every ton we put into the atmosphere has to be drawn down with some sort of technology in the future, which at the moment is non-existent. So as humanity, we're saying we're pushing that stuff into the atmosphere, but we have no means of actually containing it. So the implications of the official energy demand forecast are that the emissions will equal about 70% of all fossil fuel emissions since 1900 if we follow the path I mentioned earlier on. And in a time of zero carbon budget, that seems to be pretty much suicidal. So, as the chief economist of the International Energy Agency said, there is a need to change course in a dramatic way. Gradual change is just not enough. Now, the solutions that people talk about are basically not working, unfortunately. The carbon capture and storage may help, but it's not anywhere near where it needs to be, both in the time and to the extent we need it. We need to keep working on it. If you look at other clean coal technologies, they help, but they're not really contributing the level of emission reduction we need. The rush from coal to gas with things like CSG doesn't help you because the methane leakage from CSG is probably making it worse than using coal. And you also have a whole lot of other problems in health terms and what have you in using it. And there's a small problem of aerosols, which is that if you use more and more gas in the system, you put less aerosols from coal burning into the atmosphere, which means that you'll see probably a one-off jump in temperature of somewhere between 0.5 and 0.8 degrees C over time by virtue of removing those aerosols. That's not a reason to stop to use more coal, it's a reason for getting off fossil fuels full stop. The high carbon infrastructure effectively locks emissions in for something like 50 years. And so eliminates potential solutions, which is what we're currently doing unless we start changing quickly. The major changes to the energy system take time to implement, so you need to move on them quickly. You can't afford to really wait. And we're now seeing serious discussions about geoengineering. In other words, ways and means of putting, for example, sulfates into the atmosphere to slow down the warming and provide a protective shield. Now, I mean, this is, science fiction stuff. And the trouble is we really don't know the full implications. But it is now being seriously talked about, and it's pretty dangerous stuff if we have to move to that. So it's a last possible resort. There is a lot of talk about poverty alleviation and the potential benefits in this country of supplying India, for example, with continuing coal, particularly from things like the Adani mine here in Queensland. China, if you look at the graph of coal use way back to the 60s, you get this sort of a picture, and you can see the dramatic jump in Chinese coal consumption from 2000 on, where it basically doubled. And unfortunately, the result of that is we are being pushed now, we're now seeing the rapid increase in temperature because of that, particularly that major increase in coal use. Now, if India was to follow the same path as China, you can forget containing global warming. I mean, we will never be able to stay much below 4 degrees C, which is why the whole question of getting countries like India to swap onto a non-high carbon path is so critical. And frankly, it makes absolutely no sense to be developing major coal mines to provide coal to India in these circumstances. I mean, all we're doing is not alleviating poverty, we'll be creating it in a massive scale. That's the Adani mine superimposed on Brisbane. It's one of the biggest mines in the world has ever seen, and of itself it's going to make a major dent in our ability to stay below 2 degrees C. If you were to develop the Galilee Basin with another several, even 3 or 4 mines, same problem. I mean, you are locking in much more than 2 degrees C. And India is already experiencing major heat extreme problems. This is a picture from May this year, where much of the north of India was up in the 50 degrees C, plus range. So, I understand all the concerns about the benefits Australia might gain from supplying more coal overseas, but frankly, it's just suicidal. And people need to face up to this and not keep pretending that in some way that it can all get fixed. So the bottom line is that there's a lot of debate about, whether renewables can basically replace fossil fuels, the potential instability of the electricity grid with high renewable input, which we saw recently in the South Australia debate when very high energy prices came in. Coal, being the cheapest energy source, must continue to be used domestically and exported, and so on. The climate scientists, but the science is basically telling us, look, this is nonsense. You actually have no choice. We don't have solutions to contain emissions. We cannot keep using coal or oil or gas any longer than we absolutely have to. We have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and change our consumption habits. It's not just the supply side of this. We've also got to drop demand. So societal, behavioural changes are going to be absolutely major in trying to solve this problem. If we don't do it, we just don't have a sustainable future. So this is the big challenge and the opportunity, I think, for the engineering profession, because this is the biggest investment the world has ever made, is to change the energy system in the space of the next 20 years virtually, or much of the change. And that's really, I think, the way you have to look at this. I mean, it is an enormous investment, and it's going to need all the engineering skills we can possibly find from around the world to actually pull it off. But that's really where the growth lies, where the jobs lie, where the innovation ought to be going, if we were sensible. But at the moment, I don't think we are focused on that. We're talking of innovation going in all sorts of directions, particularly in the financial markets, which is probably the least place we need it right now. So very quickly, running out of time here, but the Paris Agreement, much political euphoria about the achievements, but the problem is that Paris, in a practical sense, is pretty disastrous. The commitments basically to stay below 2 degrees C need to be coming down in these 3 lines at the bottom. The commitments actually have us, at the moment, heading to 4 to 5 degrees C. The commitments that were made voluntarily are still going to see us above 3 degrees C, with emissions continuing to increase until 2030, whereas they should be dropping. So it is nowhere near the sort of requirement we have. This is a picture of the, another way of looking at that. This is the temperature of the Holocene, the blue line at the bottom, with a jump right at the right-hand side there, where temperature's now going up. The Paris range is the grey, and you can see the tipping elements, which are already kicking off below the Paris range. And the other ones, will be at higher temperature, but these are bad enough already. So Paris really is not going to get us very far. We have to start moving rather more quickly than that. This is really what I call an existential risk. I mean, this is not something that is handled by existing risk management techniques employed by the corporate world or the financial markets. This is an existential risk which threatens the future of humanity, and we need completely different approaches to handle it. That's why I argue we need an emergency response, and that's the way that a number of the key scientists around the world are basically looking at it. That means revamping, retooling the economy as you did leading into World War II, for example. And that is something that people have regarded as an extreme view for a long time, but you're now starting to hear global leaders talking about this more and more. We're already seeing a lot of social conflict coming from climate impact, and this is the Syrian position, which was the way in which people moved from the agricultural areas of Syria into the cities, and then started migrating because of the conflict that then developed and the war that we now see. I won't dwell on that, I can talk about it later. And the Arab Spring basically was triggered by the same sort of thing. So you need really a completely different risk management framework to handle this, because what we're currently doing is sitting there really waiting for catastrophe to happen. And it means it's too late to act. So we really have to revamp the approach so we adopt a sensible risk management approach in these circumstances. So that is not an alarmist view. It's the conversation we've never had on climate change. We've never had an honest debate in this country about what it all means. It's now starting to become very clear. We need to start that conversation and build off that to look at the solutions that are really required, not just to take what is regarded as politically realistic, as we keep on hearing from both sides of politics. I mean, this is something where you cannot take that view, otherwise we will never solve it. The sort of framework, I won't go through in great detail, but it means setting out that honestly, changing the context of the debate, building coalitions who can basically support the change, doing it constructively, and basically saying, look, this is where we are, that's where we've got to get to, how do we achieve it, rather than just saying, well, look, we can only incrementally change, we can't move things too fast away from the status quo. The sort of solution that will probably emerge is something like this. This is work that colleagues of mine are doing in Europe. And you can see basically that the fossil fuel, the purplish bits here, the fossil fuel component of this peaks and then drops very quickly. Now, the increase in fossil fuel till about 2020 is needed to basically drive the development of the new low-carbon world. And then it starts to peak, and the renewable world then starts to feed on itself. But there's some very critical engineering issues in this, because one of the problems we've got is, have we actually got enough fossil fuels to be able to fund that transition, to fuel that transition, whilst at the same time keeping enough surplus energy available to run the economic system as we know it. And there are major questions as to whether that is possible. Now, if we don't have that, then of course it leads to potential social conflict, where because we can't keep the system running, you'll end up with a whole lot of political difficulties, where societies start to have to pull their belts in ways they don't like, and you see the sort of conflict we're already seeing developing, say, in Europe with the migration crisis and so on. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it is an indication of a thing that a colleague of mine calls the Seneca cliff, where things grow very gradually. We've seen fossil fuels grow gradually for decades, and then suddenly it collapses. It comes from Lucius Seneca, I think, a Roman philosopher a long time ago, which said, increases are of sluggish growth, but the way to ruin is rapid. So we need to be aware that that's what we're dealing with, and we can talk about that in the question time if you like. So I won't go through these in great detail given the time limits, but climate change must be the primary concern. You are going to have to see an energy framework dictated by climate requirements, and the efficiency and conservation of energy use is actually critical there. You have to look at fundamental changes to our infrastructure around the world, around the country, and the way cities develop, rail transport and so on. Something one of your colleagues mentioned at the Sydney meeting is refrigeration. which we don't think very much about, but it actually is a major problem in the way the world is currently working, and the need to actually rethink the way we approach refrigeration. So the leverage point at the moment in all of this is very much the corporate governance arena as far as my activities are concerned, where you're starting to see major write-downs in stranded assets, climate risk rising, increasing emphasis on fiduciary responsibility of directors for not recognising these risks, divestment by investors, resolutions coming up at annual general meetings demanding that companies start to take these things into account, legal action against some companies and directors who are not doing the right thing, which is now starting in the US. Hasn't started here, but it might. And increased regulation from groups like the Bank of England insisting that climate risk is now addressed seriously. So just to summarise, really our future depends on having a healthy global economy. That is only going to happen if global warming, climate change is addressed. The societal benefits of doing that are actually unprecedented. I mean, if we can get this right, then you have a completely different world emerging. But the investment to do it is going to be enormous. So it is going to mean we have to rethink economic growth, but we probably need to do that anyway, because the neoliberal system has got us into this mess, and it's not going to get us out of it without considerable rethinking. I'm not saying that from a political point of view, just a hard-nosed practical aspect. The market will not solve this in isolation. We need that leadership, institutional, corporate, community leadership, because we won't see politics lead on this. I think politics will follow, but it's not going to basically lead it. So we need these issues to be taken up by organisations like Engineers Australia to start getting out there the facts, not in an alarmist or a negative sense, but in the sense that this is what we're faced with, and only if we put this out clearly can we build the solutions that are really going to get us to the point we have to get to. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ian. I should have mentioned earlier that the webinar people can put questions in, and I think they went out with the instructions in joining the webinar. And I'm hoping we have had some questions in from those one so far. Okay, you might bring that one up to me in a minute, but the rest is 2 or 3 questions for Ian now. And remember, we've got a panel towards the end. Who'd like to run off first? Do you want to read out the question that's come in?
What is the energy return on energy invested for solar and wind?
That's something that is changing very quickly. Depending on who you listen to and depending how you define it, it probably ranges from anywhere between, for solar for example, something like 8 to 1 up to 25 to 1 or higher. For wind, in some circumstances it can be as high as 50 to 1, but in others it's considerably lower than that, possibly down around the 10 to 1, and sometimes lower again. It depends, really where you are in the world and the consistency of the whole thing.
Hi Ian, my name's Cheryl. I have a question about Engineers Australia's role and the role of professionals inside this country, because we have a not insignificant number of engineers practicing who are all members of this particular institution. So my question is, in the context of your recommendation about energy being the platform for engaging in change in the next 2 decades, it might be for the panel as well, do we have a top 3 to-do list items that are very direct and action-oriented over the next year to help catalyse your larger agenda in terms of fiduciary duty and all the other director company activities?
Sorry, the question was, how you do it, yeah.
Members can actually become involved in engaging in that change process.
To me, the big vacuum in this whole debate is the vacuum between what the science is saying and what the political world is assuming. In between, there's the question of risk. And very few people are actually talking about the real risk implications of how we handle this, and indeed the opportunities, because you can't, you have both, you have both risk and opportunity. Now, it seems to me that in the corporate world should be the experts in risk, but they, to a large degree, have abrogated responsibility at this point, in my view, because they're tending to say, well, governments better tell us what the rules will be, and then we will respond accordingly. My view is that that really is just not good enough. I mean, in your own self-interest, have to recognise there are major risk exposures. You have to be honest about what they are. And it's engineers who, par excellence, are the people who should actually be thinking about these things, because you're the guys who design all this stuff, right? You have safety limits, you have safety factors. So I think there is a major role for engineers in articulating the risk implications of this and the way in which they basically can be managed. The second thing I think is that the professions need to start taking a position on these things publicly. I'm not just saying engineers, but I mean the same applies, quite frankly, to directors, to even the legal profession and accounting professions and what have you, because professional standards, you all have codes of ethics, you have standard procedures, standard codes of various kinds. This is absolutely critical. If we don't get this right, then the entire system is going to get into big trouble. And I think it's up to the professions to start articulating that in a world where other people are basically not doing it.
I might just add, Cheryl, that earlier today we had a workshop around what Engineers Australia can do, both itself as an organisation and for its members, in encouraging them to speak up in their workplace and so on. One more question.
Ian, in the psychology of change, it's the question that's important, not the answer. We have the answer that climate change is real. Are we not asking the right question?
In a psychological sense, I'm continually told that you can't scare the horses. The debate in this country, in my view, has never, as I said, had an honest conversation about the implications of climate change. If you listen to most of the NGO activist groups, they don't want to get into this debate because they have chosen, for whatever reasons, and some of them good reasons historically, to want to be involved with the government on coming up with a solution. Now, if you want to take that position, it means that you have to accept the government agenda. Otherwise, you're asked to leave the room. So what you end up with is solutions built around political compromise and what's politically realistic, not solutions based on the real problem. So from an engineering point of view, there needs to be an honest debate about what the problem is, and we're not having it.
But we don't get behavioural change until we get perceptual change. Unless we ask the right question, we're not going to get perceptual change.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is you've got to start asking the right question about what the implications are, and we're not doing it. And once you've done that and you get that discussion rolling, then you can start to get somewhere, right?
Thanks, Ian. Sit down and we'll move on. I just want to caution, right, we hear a lot about geoengineering and putting mirrors in space to reflect some of the heat away from the planet, putting particles in the atmosphere to induce cooling. The problem with that, of course, is that the fossil fuel industry will simply say things like, oh, that's good, we can keep burning fossil fuels because the engineers are fixing it with geoengineering. So that has a negative feedback, if you like. But even if we take the 1.5 degree limit, energy efficiency and renewables and all of the things that engineers can do still don't get us to the point where we have a carbon system, a carbon cycle system, that will get us to 1.5. So drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere is going to be essential if we really want to get to 1.5. And that's where engineers, I believe, should be showing some incredible leadership in finding how we can draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. Moving on, it's now my great pleasure to bring up our next speaker, who is Neil Greet. Neil's the owner of a consultancy company in Canberra called Collaborative Outcomes. He provides strategic advice on resiliency to governments around Australia. He's done a lot of work in humanitarian engineering in Timor-Leste and other places, which we won't talk about tonight. He's also served in the Australian Defence Force, operational service in Iraq and Timor-Leste, led projects in several remote Indigenous communities, and played a key role in Defence's response to Victoria's Black Saturday, the big bushfire disaster down there. He's a civil engineer and was the 2015 President of Engineers Australia's Canberra Division. Neil's going to hopefully give us the hope and the bright side of what we can do to solve the dilemma that Ian's drawn our attention to. Would you welcome Neil?
Wow, what a mission you've given me, David, to be upbeat and do the hope side. I've heard Ian speak several times, and I think that's an absolutely fascinating discussion about what is happening. And I have given this a lot of thought. Well, what is the response? What are we going to do? So after having heard it, I think 3 times now, I've got a chance to probably say what I might think, and I'd be interested to get some feedback. So thanks, David, Peter. It's wonderful to be up here in Brisbane. Hello to the webinar audience. I sat in on the first one last year. It was a good experience. It's an excellent thing that we're doing with the webinars. So yeah, and I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of our land and acknowledge the elders past and present too. And last night I was just at a presentation about emergency management. You can see I have a slant towards disaster work, and the Director General of Emergency Management Australia was talking about catastrophic management for disasters in the future, and some of what we've been talking about goes to that heart about that risk. But he was talking about how Indigenous populations had a greater understanding about how to actually manage catastrophic disasters, and he thinks we've lost a lot in that thing. So when we say that little trite thing at the start, sometimes it sounds that way. It is actually a true acknowledgement that there's people that have gone before and have understood some of this stuff that we're talking about and how you actually adapt and change. So I think it's actually really important, not just something you say at the start of a speech. So what I would like to say is I think what tonight might be is the start of building up a narrative about what we might talk about, what climate change is and what we actually do about it. So I better get to the slides so I see that they actually work. Yep. So that's what I want to talk about. So my aim is to give you some ideas about transition strategies. And what I want to talk about is the vulnerabilities and explain how the energy security work, which I've done previously, which some of you may have heard about. It's not the same set of slides, it's remarkably different. But that energy security work helps identify the vulnerabilities. And I want to talk about a resilience framework as a method of response to vulnerability. And if you're expecting me to tell you that there is an energy transition strategy, which is where you build X and you make X, you build it in Y and the world's going to be perfect, you've come to the wrong presentation, right? And if you think of that, if you think about what Ian's just said and you think that there is a solution about X and Y and Z, then that is not the way this is. This is a wicked problem. It will be something we have to work on over generations, and we continually have to adapt and change the problem. So it's not X and Y and Z as a solution. So the first point is, I know this is really simple, but that person, sorry I didn't see because I had my back to, said about framing things and asking the right question. It is very important to frame energy as not just a commodity, right? It's not even an essential service now. It underpins our society and what we do. And whilst you might just think this is a simple thing, if you cannot get this into our head, then all we'll do is we'll think the market is the only response to managing energy, right? Because you think of it as a commodity. You think of it as something that's traded around the world, it's delivered to the power board on our wall, or it's delivered to the manufacturing industry and people make things. So fundamentally, you must think about it as an issue for society. Once you do that, you start to frame energy in a different way. So this is the heart of what I want to talk about, and it's about an energy transition strategy, right? And this is where I mean to say to you that energy is not just a commodity, right? And it is about all the other levers that you can apply to make a difference to energy. So if we must think of transition in these terms if we can adapt to the imperatives that Ian has laid out. And concentrating on just one lever is foolhardy. And more importantly, addressing the multiple levers here is a way we can actually get a strategy or something that will adapt to our changing conditions. And you'll note there I've got moral and ethical responsibility. And someone will say to me, probably someone here or out there in the webinar, how can you possibly plan moral and ethical responsibility? Well, one of the things about when the Industrial Revolution did happen and all those changes were happening there and there was this great leap forward with energy, is there were enormous moral philosophy going on at the time. There was great changes with John Locke and John Hobbes who were talking about, who were the people who were then taken across and that was put into the American Constitution. So moral and ethical responsibility in the way it matches into changing transition strategies has been done in the past. But just in our pragmatic, very limited stovepipe way, we don't think about that anymore. And it is about community engagement. If you think about just levering the market and supply and demand, you won't understand the community. Or in fact, as recently down with Santos in New South Wales, they completely missed the point with the shut the gate. They missed the point that the community would actually come back at them. So if you only think of things in one dimension, you will not be able to transition. And sorry, for anyone here, that's been adapted from a famous strategy. And if anyone can guess who it is, I'll shout you to a beer. So that's something to stay around for the chat. Someone please ask me who that's been adapted from. So this is not change management and the C's disappeared, as sometimes things change with this, right? Change management is not a transition strategy, right? Yes, it is about changing and transitioning within an organisation, but it's responding to external and internal stimulus to advance the cause of that organisation or business, right? Transition strategy is completely different to that. And it's about changing for the existential purposes that Ian was talking about, not for operational reasons to advance your own self-interest, right? So it's not about change management. So it's not about, forgive my cynicism, there might be some very experienced change managers out there who do an extraordinary job and an extraordinary good job, but it's not about the balance sheet, which tells us that everybody will be nice and happy in the job, and then someone over there on the left, sorry, we've got a pointer on here. No, I better not press that. So over on your right, sorry, who suddenly realise, oh, what? That means my job's going to disappear, because change management is often about efficiency and driving efficiency against the balance sheet. So what we're talking about is deriving a transition strategy that makes it better for the world. And that's a substantially different thing. So do we get transition wrong? Boy, oh boy, do we get transition wrong in the world, right? Got two American examples for you, right? Because it's a good time to bash Americans with President Trump about to arrive on our doorstep, right? And you think, you're laughing, but you wait. Right. So first of all, we had General Tommy Franks back in 2003 unleashing shock and awe on Iraq, right? And 5 months later, General George Bush announced mission accomplished on the aircraft carrier. And you know how the story goes, right? In fact, the story's still unplaying. And at the heart of this was actually a strategic failure of transition. The American forces in 2003 thought that they would roll through Iraq as they did, and it would just like be World War II in France, where they would be welcomed as heroes who'd liberated them from the great dictator. And that's not how it transpired. There was no plan for stabilisation. The Department of State had not been engaged to how they would manage the population. So there was no plan for transition. And at the point of that, the whole key point of this is that when you become strong and powerful and you think you've got the world solved, you don't think about transitioning. You just believe that what you give them is the result, and that's the way you live. So how can the world's greatest military and diplomatic power get it so wrong? But not only that, 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. Again, the greatest nation grew complacent about the response to catastrophic disaster. It didn't know how to transition and change in response to catastrophe. The alignment of federal, state, local, county responsibilities was disastrous. The governance responsibilities were laid out for what they were. The complacency with the systems inside New Orleans it was just not there. There was no plan to respond and transition after disaster. And what happened is, down there on the right-hand corner, you got the depraved disaster that occurred for about 4 days in the football stadium, where basically things fell apart. People went back to a very base form of humanity. And that happened after one disaster and after only about 3 days after the disaster itself, and lasted for another 3 days. But it shows you how quickly people can change and go and change for the worst. So, we can get it wrong, and we do get it wrong, and actually, I'd put it to you, we don't think about transition as a strategy for many things that we do in this country, and we certainly don't think about it from a climate change perspective. So I've been doing some work, some of you are aware, for Engineers Australia, about actually understanding our vulnerabilities to shock, and that was looking at energy security. So we did that back in 2014. And the major reason for that was we wanted to actually contend that the National Energy Security Assessment, by the way, just a quick show of hands, I always do this. How many people actually know there's a National Energy Security Assessment? 1, 2. That's pretty good, actually. How many of you read it? Don't worry. Right. Okay. And that goes to the point. People aren't concerned in Australia about energy security. It's just here. We're in lights. Things work. It is good, right? But that's the problem with our definition, is it's just on adequacy, it's just on reliability, and it's just on the competitiveness of the different sectors and how that delivers the best price to the consumer. That's what we define energy security. Now, we're expecting a 2016 version. Should have come out 2015, but we'll get there, and hopefully we'll be able to see how we might assess, or how this government assesses energy security. So hopefully we'll get a new version soon. But it's important to note that that energy security definition actually comes from the International Energy Agency. And it's really important to understand that this connection was that the International Energy Agency, which has an extraordinary professional organisation, the stats it proves, there is just an enormous body of great work there. So I'm not talking about any of that. It was created after the oil crisis of World War II. And essentially this definition of energy security goes to the heart of why the IEA was set up, and it's about defining energy security in supply for us, the Western nations. So OPEC couldn't pull any more Swifties on us and do what they did to us in the oil crisis. So we're living with an energy security definition that was generated to respond by Western nations to the oil crisis of 1970, and we, and I put our Australian government, we don't want to change it because that's the definition that we've always had. So what that means is we don't understand the other vulnerabilities that are coming through and will actually affect our energy security. We are blind to those other vulnerabilities. And now you've just heard about those other vulnerabilities. So this is what we suggested out of our report in 2014. Because if you don't understand what the vulnerabilities are from energy security, you're not going to change. You'll just continue to live in that same paradigm. So this is the dilemma with energy and climate, is you can have this something hitting you in the face and saying you've got to change, but when you're sitting down there and doing this energy planning, you're just continuing to look at it in one dimension and looking at it only for one solution. So you'll only ever find the solution we've got if you don't actually change the definitions for security and look at different vulnerabilities. So I think this is one of the problems. This is the dichotomy of what we're trying to do with energy and climate, is we just don't match the two. We don't think about how the systems come together in a strategy. But that's what we suggested. So we suggested get those thoughts in there. We'd get the whole sustainable environmental security in there, social stability, energy stress, and talk about those things. But some people don't believe that we should interconnect. And this, we went to the Senate Estimate Committee last year on Australia's transport resiliency. That was Engineers Australia. And the Australian Petroleum Institute was very much against the interconnection of energy and energy and defence security issues, so bringing in national security issues and combining that, because they see energy, and in particular the oil industry, as particular market-based economic considerations only, and that they should be completely different processes in different parts of government, which is the way they happen now. So what that does is that drives stovepipe solutions which don't connect with each other. Now that simply ignores the modern world of security where everything is interconnected. The migration was mentioned. If climate change and the way it will affect all elements of security is something that certainly the United States, and that's a good word for them, so they are very good, truly understands, and they connect that to migration, they connect it to all the different parts of security. Security is a much more multi-dimensional, non-traditional, full of non-traditional threats these days. Yet, when we talk about energy, the energy industry wants to drive it down as though energy security is just something different, and you stay the same, she'll be right, mate. Leave it there. Going good. So, what I think is we need a bit of a multi-dimensional energy security framework. And this is the framework that I'm suggesting we look at. So, our energy security defines the ends that we want. We want a secure and prosperous Australia. So it's about our ends. A resilience framework, which I'm going to talk a bit more about now, defines the ways in which we can look at it. So it's a strategy to address the wicked problem that brings energy and climate change together. And then the means, see, we all get locked in those means down the bottom, and that's the problem. Because everyone says the means are actually the ends, right? So the way we do energy generation, it's not the answer by itself. Nor is investment, the question about investment, that's not the answer by itself. Nor is political will. They are the means. Those are the things that they are the levers that we pull if we've actually got some vision on this problem. And sorry, I know that I've been banging the market, but if you just want to look at another argument about the place of the market, have a look at the Australian Financial Review looking at that markets are not always the best when it comes to infrastructure. It's an article out of the Financial Times, in fact, and it actually talks about energy infrastructure in the UK, right? That the way that's happening in the UK is not responding to the actual need for energy security in the United Kingdom. So it's about framing. I'll come back to that person because I thought that was such a good, thank you, right? It's about how you frame it if you want to get the right, if you want to move and actually make a change, right? I don't think it's about actually getting an answer. Right, so now if I can just turn to resilience, right? So I've got some slides here from the Australian Security Policy Institute, and I'll follow through a theme there now with the Australian Security Policy Institute, whom I'm doing some work for. So inherent in that, in just saying to you that I'm doing that, you can see this connection between engineering and security and how energy security is connected to the real world of security. So something fails, right? I was so pleased to see the Seneca curve. Now I understand what I can talk about with respect to failure, a threshold failure, when I talk about resilience. So something fails, okay? Now, what resilience is about, and this could be a little point for a discussion. Resilience is not, it's not about Premier Anna Bligh standing up there and saying, we're tough north of the border. I know you all are, sorry, right? But we're tough and we breed them tough up here. It's not about tough, resilient people. It's not sons of Anzac, sons and daughters of Anzac, and we do things right. It's not about that sort of resilience. Resiliency is actually about changing. And it's actually moving through phases. And the best example I can give is if during climate change, rainfall patterns do change, and a rainforest no longer gets the rain that it normally got, it will change to another form of wetland forest. Species will actually move off and move to different areas. Things will actually change, right? So resiliency is not about doing the same thing and being tough, right? It's not about being psychological tough and doing those sorts of things. It's actually about adapting to change and having different states where you actually move to different states and you actually understand that you're making those changes. Hopefully we don't get to that point, right? So, I've done some work with ASPI, the Australian Security Policy Institute, and we've looked particularly at this issue of energy resiliency. And in framing those sorts of options that you might have with inside a resilience framework, we come up with these three things of reforming the electricity grid, addressing transport energy, David, I know about it, so I'll talk about that, right, and future-proofing cities. And what this is trying to do is it's trying to say a resilience framework can pull a number of things together and articulate them so that we can actually see how the systemic influences come. But you only get to understand those systemic influences if you change your view of energy security, if you actually think those things are important. Otherwise, all three things, they're just disparate strategies managed by different departments, done by different businesses, and everyone's just humming along in the world nicely. So the first one, reforming the grid. So we've heard a few things about the new smart technologies that we can put into this. One of the key things is that with microgrids, I heard a wonderful presentation about the microgrid at the University of San Diego. Now, this microgrid only puts out 7 megawatts, but in the wildfires of 2007, this microgrid was actually the piece of infrastructure that was actually able to put enough energy back into the San Diego grid to actually save the grid from going down in the wildfires. Now, that actual concept actually builds resilience in the face of a catastrophe back into our energy infrastructure. But there's a really important ethical question here, is what responsibility did San Diego have to put that 7 megawatts back into the grid? They didn't have to do it. It was their microgrid, their energy for their university, right? So if we put out a grid in the future which has microgrids and there are other people using it, what legal obligation do they have to put energy back into the grid to save us from some form of catastrophe? Now, when we start to, and this is why moral and ethical issues are really important to consider in this transition strategy, because if we're not thinking about those sorts of things, we'll arrive at some point where some hard-nosed person in their community is going to say, no, stuff you, my group of people are more important than yours, and we'll have a larger social failure as a consequence of catastrophe. So I think in reforming the grid, it's not just about technical solutions. They are an intrinsic part of how we'll change the grid, but it's not just about that. And I've got there affordability and transition incentives to change. There is some wonderful work being done about how do you change the use from brown coal in Victoria. How do you actually give a market incentive to actually move off that? And that sort of building in those economic incentives requires great change to our economic system and thinking, and ANU's doing some very good work on that, and perhaps others are too. But the biggest design impediment is lack of will, complacency. We don't see it. There's no need to actually reform our grid because she'll be right, mate. The biggest enemy is ourselves, and we just don't want to make change, and that apathy. So, our national electricity market, East Coast, world's longest interconnected grid, right? I think it's been mentioned there. Fossil fuels generate 86% of our national electricity market. So it works well. I mean, we've got our lights on now, and I don't think, unless something really strange happens, we'll have any blackouts during this phase. So it is highly reliable. And perhaps some of you there and out there on the webinar are the engineers who actually make sure that we have one of the highest reliability electricity networks in the world. But what could possibly go wrong? Well, right. What could possibly go wrong? Let me turn to Tasmania. Is anyone there from Tasmania? Hello to all my Tasmanian friends if you're down there, right? We haven't forgotten you, right? The energy crisis has unfolded down there in the first half of this year. So to quickly bring you up to speed, approximately 40% of Tasmania's electricity comes from Victoria through the undersea Basslink interconnector. 40% also comes from hydroelectricity sources, and the remaining 20% is spread across some low-scale solar and wind generation. In December 2015, the Basslink connected to the national electricity market suffered a failure. And by April, the hydroelectric dams, that's this April just gone, were at 13% storage capacity. Hydro Tasmania had forward sold electricity back to the national electricity market to take advantage of carbon tax incentives, being a renewable resource, and they gambled on normal rain in a forecast El Nino year. Right. An emergency generation plan based on spot 200 megawatt diesel generation was enacted, but never needed because it did rain, and Basslink was finally repaired in June of this year. So it's interesting to note that in the 2015 the energy strategy, energy security was just bedded down in section 3.6 with the assured goal of affordable and secure energy for all Tasmanians. It sounds so wonderful when you say it like that, doesn't it? But there was no plan, right? Now there's a Tasmanian Energy Security Task Force established, and there's a consultation paper that's been put out here. And it's actually great that they are reviewing and the need to recognise the failures and improve. However, the word resilience is not mentioned once. Risk is used 20 times. And what's even more interesting is that half of that time risk is co-joined with price or cost risk, right? So it's a firm indication of how this review on energy security actually looks at risk. The paper is structured on generation sources. So it looks at the stovepipes of hydro, national electricity market supply from Tasmania, gas, renewables, and asks questions on how each market can adapt. So immediately it's putting us back into the old paradigm. It's asking the questions, well, something went wrong. How do we do the same old and keep doing it? So where are we going to make change? And this is extraordinarily important to all of us, right? This is the new age of security, right? And it is real. So when we'll leave it to, let's have a discussion about Ausgrid, right? Because there needs to be a mature, sensible discussion about why Ausgrid's sale never went through, right? Instead of some of the silly discussions that are going on at the moment. Transport fuel, right? Now, our energy white paper said that, I'm sorry that the pictures have slipped up, so just that last bit, forces technologies that are not cost competitive in the market at a cost that will cost consumers or taxpayers, right? So basically, it's all hands off, the market will sort out our transport fuel, right, David? That's what they're going to do for you, right? That's what the energy white paper says. But it ignores the fact that that's what's been set up for us beforehand. And don't underestimate the man to your right, Robert Moses, and the influence that he had on the whole way that transport around the world is done. He built the highways, freeways and interstates in New York, and in the process destroyed most of New York to achieve that goal because he had a vision of what the car was going to be for the future. Now, he has extraordinary foresight in what he achieved with that, but I wonder just where that foresight ended. And I'd say it's pretty well now, right? But it's not, so it's about that industry being set up already. It already has the market advantage, but that's all right. We're not going to change that because the market will have to change itself. But David, we're doing some work on that, right? About the change. So the work that David's done on looking at new transport strategies, it has a home in an energy transition strategy that looks at that. So it's all part of a broader picture, not just a singular stovepiped thing. And it's all about future-proofing our cities, right? So the wonderful city of Brisbane. I was born in Ipswich, so I do know a lot about this place. So this is where our cities, where it all happens. It's where transport energy, where the grid comes together, and it's the one place that we have to look at for resilient options for the future. And I'm not sure how many of you know about the Rockefeller 100 Cities initiative, but Sydney and Melbourne are part of a worldwide program of Rockefeller. So both Sydney and Melbourne have chief resilience officers paid by the Rockefeller Foundation. Right now, Brisbane didn't get it, but neither did any other Australian city. However, if the Rockefeller Foundation is investing money into 100 cities worldwide to look at resilience, then I'd say to you there's a good reason for that, and we do have to future-proof our cities and we do have to make change. And energy underpins a modern city. So I promised innovation would be one of my last slides. That's what he said. I heard him on the radio, right? I was in the car and I thought, because he spoke at the National Press Club, and I thought, that just says it all, right? So there's this magic idea that innovation's going to always keep, as I heard someone say, the plough ahead of the mouth, that somehow innovation will always save us, right? Innovation will not mean anything if it's not part of a coherent strategy that actually puts it together and we can actually frame it so that we can actually adapt to climate change, right? So on that note, that's me, all right? So it's about building an energy security narrative. It's about changing the way we look at things. The market is not a plan, right? It's just one of the levers that we pull. And the answers are not in the past, are not necessarily in the past. We have to look at how we're going to actually face the biggest threat for humanity ever. And I'd say to you, a plan for a resilient future, when you look at an energy transition strategy, there's some ideas for you. It's not about building X, Y and Z in a certain plate or in a certain electorate. Thank you. You got another one? Yeah, there you go.
Oh, thank you, Neil. That was excellent. I think I have a little bit of hope.
Oh, okay.
Particularly as I picked up on a feed yesterday where the ANU is doing some remarkable work on biofuel from eucalyptus leaves, if anyone's seen that. And it picks up on some of the work that Richard Branson is funding in terms of his aviation fleet, in terms of how we can have biofuels to power aircraft. Because as Ian Lowe once famously said, we've got to keep all of the fossil fuel oils for aeroplanes because there's nothing else that you can feed into an aeroplane jet engine. So stop driving cars with petrol and use it for aviation. So a couple of questions for Neil, and then we'll open the panel discussion. Any come through from the webinar? People specifically for Neil? Okay, we'll take yours again, up the top there.
Neil,
Yep.
are you aware of Jeffrey Wright's presentation of why cities grow people or companies that people die in cities
No, I'm not.
and life gets faster?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so they're just asking me to repeat in here. So am I aware of Jeffrey Wright's presentation on cities?
Why cities grow,
Why cities grow,
companies and people die,
and
life gets faster.
and life gets faster. No, I'm not aware of that. So,
Now, in that presentation, he has why cities grow is because it's a J curve and progressively faster
Yep.
J curves of innovation.
yep,
Until, if you look at the overall graph, it becomes one J curve and we're heading for collapse.
yep.
So
Yep. So,
you had that two-dimensional resilient model.
yes, yep,
Whereas a resilient model is an n-dimensional space where there are tipping points that are much lower than the peaks.
yeah. Well, that's what I'm trying to say. Yes, that is what I meant to imply, is that there is that peak and you drop below that peak, so that it's not living the same life. It's not doing the same thing. So I was trying to communicate that.
Yes,
All right.
That's a
Yeah.
rather more planar
Yeah.
than the two-dimensional space that you project.
Yeah. No, that's true. Yep.
Question from someone viewing on the webinar. The greatest impediment to transitioning the power grid is the fact that it has been privatised to corporate owners who want to pursue economic interests only and maximise the return on their past investments. How would you respond to that, Neil?
That's
public ownership?
no, I don't think that's the answer either. Right. I do think there is balance of investment is very good and does drive efficient and effective power grids. So I think ownership, private ownership, is not a bad thing at all. Right. But there's got to be a strategy about how that's done, not an ad hoc, done half in one state, done sort of there, and one state's, Victoria decided to do it under Jeff Kennett in '96. Other states are lagging. That's not. There's no strategy to this. That's the problem, is that it happens on an ad hoc nature, and it's not planned. And do you want me to mention Ausgrid there?
Yeah.
The point is that selling Ausgrid opens up cyber security. It does, and it's not about China. It's about any country. Is that if you have an interconnected grid in these days, with the cyber effects and the age And if I go back to that San Diego example, a little university in the United States, they were hacked, and their microgrid was hacked through a air conditioner, actually through air conditioner software that was supporting their microgrid. So the way you can be hacked is amazing. That's right. So that's right. So our grid is a national security asset. It is critical infrastructure, right?
Question from the floor? Yeah. Thank you.
Look, opening up, you said
Right.
that we've got a national security paper, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And you asked how many people have actually read it.
Yep.
And frankly, I've never heard of it.
Yep.
Assuming everyone reads it and, you know, who pushes the button to get that active in the community? How does that get from being a red paper to something that's being acted upon by our government or by,
Yep.
by our
Okay.
community?
So the question was about our national security assessment, the paper that was done. How do we actually get the community to be actually engaged in that, as opposed to something that nobody reads and it sits on a thing? And I think that's where I started from with this work, right? And if I can just tell that little story, I had a friend who was talking first of all about transport fuel security, which is another issue in itself, right? And he alerted me to this national, I wasn't even aware of it, and the flaws of it. And we then looked at the wider energy security issue and we thought engineers aren't engaged in this. There's no way that engineers who are so implicit in energy and the technological advances, there's no way we can be part of that discussion. So what I'm doing right now is trying to get it out into the community space, that we actually need to talk about it, that we actually need to think about our security. So unless you've got a better idea, we've got to change this, and we do have to get it out of just being something on the shelf in Canberra.
I have one idea, and that
Yep.
is that we need some consumer education at the same time as we're...
Yep.
Like, it's all very well for us as engineers to innovate and develop
Yep.
solutions. But if the consumer marketplace is not thinking along the lines of using what we're developing or perceiving that there's a need for it, then it's never going to get support, it's never going to gain any momentum anywhere.
So I'm saying the same. It's about getting out and talking, say the same thing. Get out to the community.
What I'm asking is, how do we push that button in the community? How do we get that engagement as engineers? How do we promote that? Thinking about it.
Yeah, how do we frame how do we frame that engagement? Well, I think today might be an example of how you can frame it. There's this threat, right? And how do we actually respond to the climate change threat? Here's the way we're going to do it. Here's the way the community's engaged. It's much more than just switching on a light. But the Australian public, they don't want to hear that at the moment. What worries me with saying that to you is the apathy. Right? So how do you change apathy? Anyone got the answer to that question? So sorry.
Okay. I'll ask Ian to join us up here, and we'll move into the panel session. We've got a few questions from the webinar viewers, and I'll start putting one of them to both of you. Would you please use the microphones, and when we have questions from the floor here, so that the webinar viewers can hear it, can ask you to repeat the question before you answer it. Question from a webinar viewer is, in their June report, CEDA recommended that Australia adopt the equivalent of a UK climate change risk assessment, which they are producing every 5 years across all sectors and across the whole of the UK. Can Engineers Australia champion this idea for Australia and our near neighbours, I suppose? Microphone. You have to use the microphone. Yeah.
So is that on? So that is on, isn't it? Yep, good. So the question was, how can...
No, you don't need to repeat that.
Oh, I don't have to repeat that, sorry.
I need from the audience. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So, look, I've looked at the UK work. I think there's enormous things that are being done across government. One of the great things in the UK is that they actually do take the climate change seriously across politics, right? And they actually then have the departments working with each other. So when they do have that seeded the response, the fight, and they actually update it, there's actually a plan to do something. So should we be championing what the UK does? I actually think, yes, we should. There's a real opportunity. And I don't think it's a threat to Australians to champion something from the UK, because it's of the cultural closeness that we have. Sorry, I should be just talking to David. Is that so it should be something we can do. And the UK has done some remarkable work on energy literacy too. And that comes to that point here, getting out and talking to people so that the community is actually more literate about what energy is, and that's about community engagement. So I think yes is in that. A lot of words around yes.
Has Brexit made a big difference over in the UK? And we now have Clexit, of course, climate exit from coming out of the UK.
That does worry me. I'll give you the chance there.
I think just coming back to the original point about risk, whether it's the UK system or not. I mean, it's the point I made earlier on. There is a vacuum around risk in the Australian debate, and I think engineers should fill it, frankly. I mean, if you can get major corporates to start talking in realistic terms about the risk, that would be great too. But it is par excellence an issue for engineers. So yes, I would totally support the idea of EA coming out and adopting a position on this. Just to come back to the UK, of course, there is a downside to the UK, which is that the way their energy system is currently going, they're locking into a massive nuclear development. If that same amount of money was spent on renewables, they'd be way, way ahead, I suspect. And, it all links in. I mean, you can see the thinking, I think, which says, look, we need to maintain a nuclear position because of not just energy, but also our defence position and so on. So there's a whole myriad of interrelated issues, and it would be nice if we had a more integrated approach in Australia to all of this, which did genuinely take a holistic approach to looking at the total picture. So I think that's really what we have to aim for. It's another thing I think engineers could take up and put on the agenda.
That's a webinar question, actually. Would you please comment on the low role of nuclear to meet our future energy requirements in Australia?
Well, just to finish it off, I mean, I don't think you can afford to ignore nuclear because the problem is so big. I don't think the sort of UK-type Hinkley massive developments are going to be the way to go. I mean, the only one that's currently, or I think one of two being built around the world at the moment, the new Finnish plant is about 15 years late, and I think at the last count was about 6 times over budget of that order.
Cost
So
of
there are
nuclear is
massive
going up.
problems in terms of these big nuclear plants. And but on the other hand, there's a lot of new technology starting to come out on pebble bed reactors and things of that kind, which we should be taking a very close look at.
Let's get a question from the audience.
Can I just, quickly.
Neil?
Because I do believe in that too, actually. I believe that there's a real opportunity to get small modular reactors into Australia, right? And to make use of them. So they are not the big plants that you're talking about in the UK at all. They're very localised. For instance, for mining operations up in the north, when big remote communities, instead of sucking diesel fuel, which is what they do, a small modular reactor, which is very safe, very small, built in a factory, so it has very good tolerances, it's not built on site, is a very good option for those sorts of things. The other thing is, clever nuclear scientists make very good renewable engineers, I found, because they actually do the same science and all that sorts of things. So the education side of it and building up some education in that, I think, so I'm not as clear-cut as some people are against it all. And don't forget, we're buying French submarines, and the French submarines are nuclear, and maybe we will be one day too, but I didn't say that.
Engineers Australia has I'm not sure if it's actually an approved policy, but one of our aims is to ensure that if nuclear is adopted in this country, we have Australian engineers trained and able to take charge. Yeah. I'm going to ask for a question from the floor here.
I just want your views on whether existing renewable technology and storage abilities is sufficient. If we have no further development, could we feasibly run our country's energy needs on existing technologies, ignoring nuclear?
The question is, can we run our country on existing renewable technology as opposed to new developments? Including storage, yeah. I mean, I think, look, there's a lot of analysis around claiming we can. There's a lot saying we can't. there obviously are questions about how you sort of integrate all of this, and whether you can do it with existing technology or not is probably difficult to say at this point. But the point is we have to go that direction. We have to find the solution. And I think as Stuart White said at the discussions we had in Sydney, I mean, people talk about, exponential increase in the size of the problem, but you've also got to recognise there's exponential increase in the speed of solutions too. So, I think you can see very positive routes through this. The cost, I mean, the changes in technology are moving incredibly fast. I mean, the cost reductions, the efficiency improvements. So, I mean, it's not going to be a static picture at all, but I think we could probably do it if we really put our minds to it right now, frankly.
So just to add, what drove my question is I listened to a radio interview recently, and frequently you hear discussion in the media, people that probably don't actually really understand the science saying, well, wind and solar can't provide baseload energy, and everyone talks about batteries. I'm not an energy scientist and sort of believed it, but a scientist talking on Radio National recently said that existing technology in hydro, off-river hydro as a storage,
Pumped storage.
pump storage is completely feasible. And so from my background, which on the energy side of things is not really any better than the average person, I thought, well, most people don't know that. Most people don't realise that there's, we don't have to have batteries, that there's an existing technology that operates very well. So I just wanted your thoughts on that and whether that's,
So anything, just to say, I've heard Professor Andrew Blakers from ANU talk about that pumped hydro, and look, that just to me seems such an obvious solution that we can make, which is storage, right? Without all the other complexities that you're talking about. But to a point of your question, see, I don't know the answer, right, whether that would be feasible, but the point I would make is nothing is the solution by itself. So I don't want to get, because this is one of the things I find difficult with the energy discussion, particularly when we have this sort of forum, is it's always playing one part of the energy generation mix off against the other. And then I really get annoyed when I see the renewables hack off the nuclear guys and they each then try and have a fight in the audience where we're all in this together. Now, I don't want that to sound too trite or too, sort of meaningless, but it's true. We actually have to have a good mix that allows us to adapt. So that's my answer to that question.
Can I just expand on your comment?
Ian, do you want to comment on that?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Just one. I mean, I think Neil's point is absolutely right. I mean, you've got to have holistic solutions. You've got to look at the total problem and the full range of possible solutions, whereas we still are looking in silos across the board. It goes on year after year, and we've got to stop doing that. As an example, if you look at Europe, the system there is using pump storage in the Swiss Alps, for example, to compensate when the wind drops or the sun's not shining in other parts of Europe. So when they've got high renewables, they're pumping water up into the Swiss Alps, into lakes, and then it comes down through the system. So it's a very interesting integrated solution to the problem. And that's the sort of stuff we could be doing too.
Beyond Zero Emissions have done a lot of work around this in terms of a holistic look. They've looked at stationary energy plan, high-speed rail, the electric vehicles report that I think Neil was referring to, which I had a bit of a hand in as the deputy chair of BZE. So that they're looking at holistic solutions. My worry with BZE, of course, is they've done the research, but we've now got to facilitate implementation of all these things.
As an observer, I get frustrated that the discussion from our politicians is that we can't start because we haven't got the final solution yet. So whereas there are solutions that would make inroads along the way as the technology is being developed.
We can't start because we haven't got the final solution.
Yeah.
That was the question.
Yeah, that was the question. I think what we're really seeing is the fact that people don't yet accept we have the problem. And therefore they're saying, well, look, somehow the existing system will sort of muddle through, and sooner or later we'll have to address it, but we don't want to get ahead of the game. The problem with that is that we lose out right the way down the track. I mean, if you look at innovation, I mean, we've had, if you look around the world, some of the core renewable technology has come from Australia.
Yeah.
It disappeared because there was no support in this country to develop it. And therefore it got
Coal
picked
was
up
so
overseas
cheap.
and so on.
Mm.
Now, you know, we didn't do it because we had cheap coal, supposedly, and we lost out in a major sense. Now we're about to do the same again in other areas unless we get ahead of the game and start using this stuff and thinking through the solutions to the real problem.
Going to go up the back with Cheryl. Yeah. Again.
A different question.
Uh-huh.
Same Cheryl, different question. I have a question in the bigger picture context, and it's directed at Engineers Australia and also perhaps with feedback from the perspective of the Institute of Company Directors in terms of capacity building. So my personal experience is we did a project on national education resources for energy efficiency 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Great project, Engineers Australia support, federal support. When we did engagement with the colleges inside Engineers Australia to say energy efficiency is in every discipline, we had 4 of the mainstream colleges, including civil engineering, questioning internally about what energy efficiency actually had to do with their major advocacy role and their capacity building role. And I say that as an environmental engineer and civil engineer, and I bring it out into the open because I think it's the elephant on the table. One of the ones we're not talking about is internal capacity building, because our own members inside our institution are still struggling with what energy efficiency and energy actually means for us day to day. So I wonder what the comments might be from yourself, Ian, in terms of AICD has so much great training for professionals and what you might be looking to see internationally in best practice. And then perhaps in terms of Neil's perspective on that capacity building, because you've been you've been in the Engineers Australia hierarchy and seen what it's like at national and state level in terms of managing this side of professional development. We all have to do it. So why aren't we doing it in priority areas that actually builds capacity to address the questions?
I might quickly repeat the question from Cheryl. I'll abbreviate it. Cheryl's done some remarkable work in terms of the education that's lacking in getting energy efficiency properly embedded in our cultures. And what is Engineers Australia, through its colleges, doing to ensure that energy efficiency takes a much higher profile? I mean, to me, it's just appalling that we haven't implemented energy efficiency to the degree that we can.
Well, I think it comes back to the point that the gentleman at the back raised earlier on. You have to start asking the right questions. I mean, we don't see energy as being a critical issue because we've always had plenty of it. It's been relatively cheap. And now we're starting to scream because the price is going up because we're exporting all the gas offshore. You know, coal, the low-hanging fruit, has disappeared. And that is a global problem. But we don't yet see energy as being the absolute fundamental driver of society in the way that we should, because it's always been too easy. Now, once you start to ask the question, well, where is energy going to? What is the interaction with climate? You completely redefine the context in which we're now operating. I mean, the 20th century model is no longer sustainable. We now have a 21st century world where the context is totally different. And until you actually start to recognise that, then all these points you're making never get addressed because we don't see it as being important. Which is why I think you come back to the fact that the professions, to me, should really be asking these questions and saying, well, what are the priorities now? Because other people are not doing it. And it's very hard for well, I say hard, I mean, we've set up a political system that finds it almost impossible to do it because everything is now so short term, and the same applies to major corporates too. I mean, the way we pay people, the reward structures in the bureaucracy in governments are such that nobody gets rewarded for thinking long term anymore. And somehow that has to change, because if we don't change it, we're not going to solve it.
Company quarterly reporting, for instance. Yeah.
So, Cheryl, to come specifically to Engineers Australia, I think we're just a microism of that big issue is that stovepiping of our colleges, which represents the way engineering was, not the way engineering is, and not the way engineering will be in the future. Just out of interest, I guess, how many people are in the environmental college here? Yes, it's the majority of the room, right? So we've got that one element there. But the truth is, engineering is multidimensional, and everyone says that, but our organisation doesn't reflect it. And when you must have went to all those different college boards, and they're all good people, so it's not about people, right? So it's not about that. So they consider it, it's not theirs. See, multidimensional is not owned by anyone, and therefore, because it's not owned by anyone, no one does anything about it. And this is always the problem for these things that cuts across, is it's not owned by someone. It hasn't got that person who takes it to the CEO and all that sort of thing. So you end up having it just being people down below, always trying to push the solutions forward. So I think it's actually a microism of that. So how do we fix it now? Well, let's leave that for something for afterwards when we have a drink.
Some work I did for the Australian government a long time ago was looking at how well understood energy efficiency and climate issues was known, and particularly sustainability agenda out in industry. And the most appalling result came back from the structural engineers of Australia. Sustainability means nothing to us. What we do doesn't interfere with sustainability at all. Actually, the best of the lot were the architectural designers, not the architects themselves, the building designers.
One thing, one analogy that may be useful is safety. If you look at the way that safety was treated in, say, the mining industry or the oil and gas industry historically, it was handled by relatively low-level management. You had safety officers and what have you. Safety performance in Australia in the mining industry never really got seriously addressed until it got to board level. Yeah. And it became an issue that directors had to front up to and were going to be questioned on at annual general meetings and through regulation and what have you. Then it got attention. And now, energy efficiency I would see as being very much in that sort of ballpark at the moment. It's not seen as a priority issue. It has to become.
Quick question from the webinar audience. Globally, which city, country would you example as leading the way along this area of energy efficiency, sustainability, and implementing the changes and that we might learn from?
Well, I guess you'd have to look at the Scandinavian countries first up, say Denmark and Norway. Well, not so much Norway, probably Denmark and Sweden actually, but also Holland. Germany in many respects as well. So there's a whole lot of examples around in that space actually.
And which of your Rockefeller cities, Neil?
I don't know that. No, I don't know the answer to that. But can I just say a country? I know this might surprise you, but China. China really will change. The imperative is there. That smog in Beijing, that's killing people, is an imperative to change. And I was there in July, and it was with solar people, so I guess I'm sort of preaching to the converted, and they're talking, but there is a real, the people, and see, it comes to their political system, that the Chinese leadership realise that if the people rebel, they will take them out, they will destroy the leadership. That's the way it works in that sort of political climate. Yeah, but this is more, this is revolution style stuff, right? So if the people are dying and the people become unhappy in China, the Chinese system will fail. They know that. And one of the ways they have to respond is to make their people safe. And one of those is they have to change their energy habits. So there's some, but I'm not saying they're there. That's why I'm not quite sure in answering the question I'm right, but I think they're changing is what I want to say.
A few years back, I remember putting into my presentation slides a fantastic image of China. 100 million homes have solar hot water in China. It was the best country leading in reforestation at the time, 6 years ago, so I don't know where they are now. Question from here, and then one more from the webinar, and then we'll get outside for some refreshments.
You discussed earlier that obviously massive investment is needed to drive this change in how we source our energy. I was wondering if you could comment on what you think of market-based mechanisms within our system as it is now, so for example pricing carbon, or do you think that this jobs and growth capitalist system is actually incompatible with a sustainable society?
A very good question. Is their capitalist system incompatible with the changes that we need?
I don't think there is any question that the neoliberal system as it's developed cannot handle the change we now have to make. I mean, it has been set up in such a way that it is totally short-term focused. The true valuation of things that matter is not included in the economic system. So in other words, we don't include the true costs of using fossil fuel, for example. You've got to move to some sort of carbon pricing mechanism. I think what's going to come out of all of this is actually a rethink of the way the capitalist system actually works. Whether it'll stay capitalist is a moot point. It's going to have to require major degrees of regulation. I think the market is valuable within that. But the trouble with the market is we've got rid of all the rules over the last 30 years. We used to have rules. We've gradually, under the pressure from increased corporate power and what have you, and ideological conservatism, if you like, have got rid of all those rules. So that you now have a completely, almost an uncontrollable system where banks can print money at will, basically, which has completely stuffed the financial stability, and where the remuneration structures that we work under forces people to be completely unsustainable. I mean, basically, we are forcing people to act in accordance with quarterly returns and all this sort of stuff. Now, until we actually reframe that and start to say, look, you've got to genuinely look at long-term solutions to problems, you're never going to get on top of it, and that's going to be hard, given where the system has got to. You've got to break that up with some sort of regulation, I think. And I think that is, you can start to see that happening. I mean, the other dimension, of course, is inequality, because what the system has done is now create this enormous inequality, particularly in places like the US.
Yeah.
The degree of wealth held by just a handful of people.
Donald Trump's going to fix that.
Yeah. So there's some very, very big problems, and I think we're going to see a fundamental shift in the way the economic system works. But I don't think you discard the market totally.
I'll just add something very quickly to that. We had a dialogue down at ASPI just last week about supply chains versus resilience, right? And funnily enough, it came down to a discussion of lean, efficient supply chains. It become a talk about capitalism, and resiliency suddenly ended up being a socialist response to society's needs. It was fascinating the way the discussion went. So, I mean, this framing, and I don't think this is helpful sometimes, the framing and things, in knowing where we sit now. It's actually responding to the threats we have. So this is where I suddenly think we get caught in a cycle sometimes, that it has to be in the box that we always put it.
The problem with the neoliberal system is that it can't bring itself to accept the sort of things we talked about tonight. And that in itself is going to be its own destruction, because it's got a framework that stops it doing that. And until you can break that framework, it's not going to get solved.
It's the cognitive dissonance of ideology. Yeah. If anyone wants a copy of our beloved Prime Minister launching the BZE Stationary Energy Plan in 2010, please see me afterwards. I'd be delighted to send it to you. And the statements that he made then about need a price on carbon, must move to zero emissions as fast as possible. Yeah, boy. One last question from webinar audience. Are we seeing the early stages of collapse predicted by limits to growth? And is it only avoidable by emergency action on climate? Club of Rome, man.
Short answer, yes. I think you can now start to see all that framework emerging. My own view is, yes, you are going to have an emergency response because of the sort of things I've gone through this evening. I mean, you have got to move extremely quickly. You're not going to do it by letting incremental change manage it. We'll never get there. We've got to start just redefining the entire framework under which this has to be done. I think we can do that. I think it's not going to be an easy process, but the solutions basically are there. What we now need is an acceptance, asking the right question is what is the problem we actually have to solve.
So classify, thinking about this as a catastrophe and something that would happen like that, I'll go back to Director General Emergency Management Australia talking about how we respond to emergencies, where a catastrophic incident is something that's low risk. Therefore, because it's low risk and low probability, we just don't plan for it, right? But in fact, he's changing the way emergency management looks across Australia, because it's the catastrophic events that actually are the ones that we do actually have to plan for and have to be prepared for. So you actually have to turn your way around from thinking, oh, you just plan to respond to low risk operations and that's how you plan your organisation, to respond into catastrophe. That's an enormous change in thinking.
That doesn't consider the quantity of the quantity of the damage, though, does it? Yeah. Okay, I think we'll draw it to a close now. Speaking of emergency action, the three of us up here have all signed the declaration to the government. We're putting this to the government to declare a climate emergency and to start thinking seriously about how we respond. Do we need a warlike footing, which got the UK through World War II, for instance? You may quickly say it, Neil.
I promised during that slide, where did I adapt my strategy from? It comes from B.H. Liddell Hart, so Declan Ellis. If you're still out there in Adelaide and didn't get that, you're a bad boy, right? He was the one who put together the grand strategy in the 30s for how you would prepare to respond to World War II, right?
Yeah.
So that grand strategy I put up as tradition strategy. That's exactly that's what that response is. So thanks for...
I have a copy of the declaration with me. If anyone wishes to join us and sign it, I'd be delighted to get your signature on the declaration. Can I now ask Dr. Andrew King, who's one of our champion SENG members, and of course the author, as you all know, of the NG Bear series, to wrap up and give the thanks.
Thank you, David. Okay, wow, what a wonderful evening so far. So many different topics, so many emotions. But what I'd like to do, rather than the traditional close of an evening, is call it an opening. And in doing this, I'd first like to thank Peter for stressing the importance of these issues to engineers and inviting us to put inviting us to put technology on the table. I think that was a great way to look at it. And then David, as always, took us. Fantastic job of being an MC. Thank you very much, David. Great pleasure. And then our two guest speakers, Ian and Neil. Kind of a good cop, bad cop routine, but in reverse. Like, am I allowed to say you scared the shit out of me? Is that? I have heard similar talks lots and lots of times. Every time I hear this talk, I hear something new and I see a different angle, and it scares me more and more. Seeing those graphs of temperature plotting back to Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets just puts it in a perspective. More and more people need to understand that. It's just stunning. And then I think your close, the reminder of the difference between a 4-degree world and a 2-degree world being human civilization, a very sobering thing. As an author, that's what you call the blue point in a book. That's when all hope is lost. And then riding along on his little white horse to bring us hope, Neil. And look, Neil did bring us hope. He mentioned variables, X, Y, and Z, and I was thinking, great, there's some engineering involved. But then we got into the multi-dimensional nature of things. And thank you, the person at the back who keeps asking about framing the question. And I think that was a theme that came through. This is a multi-dimensional thing. But engineers have a role to play in that multi-dimensional thing, which I think is a really good outcome. So I guess, Neil, the other things that you told us about were resilience, and that resilience isn't being tough, but resilience is adapting. And that's something that engineers are really good at. We talked about problem solving, and then we talked about risk and opportunity and not doing things the same way. This is home ground for engineers. We are the people that think of solutions. So I think we're in a good place. Now, what I want to do with this opening is pretty much start to fill this vacuum between politics and science. The way I look at it, as a writer again, is the climate scientists have done their job. In what I might call the book of climate, they've written chapter 1. And as everybody said, climate change is real, people are responsible for it, and we can't carry on as usual. I think the book lays open, and we've heard the forward to chapter 2, and now what we need to do as engineers is take the lead and not be lemmings, and take a leadership role in writing chapter 2. We've all brought stories and questions and ideas, and we've started the research. And thank you to everybody who talked over the internet and people in the audience. As an engineering profession and as an engineering team, I think we need to take this next chapter into the future. So that's the opening and my invitation for you and the profession to be leaders. Thank you. He loves me.
I love Angie Bear. Where's your green badge?
Okay. Alternatively, Cheryl and I talked about bald men all facing the sun with the albino effect. But yeah,
Where's your green badge?
I'm sorry.
We're both Al Gore trained
badge.
climate leaders, as is Steve up there. Is there any other Al Gore trained climate leader amongst us? Well, you've got 3 to talk to later on. Join us, please, outside and continue to chat with Neil and Ian and Andrew and me. And thank you so much for Engineers Australia for facilitating this fantastic evening. And the webinar, yeah.